Alright, this is 8.1 Part 2, Completing the Square. Now, completing the square is used a lot. At this point of the game, though, it's not that important because people just want to rely on using the quadratic equation. But completing the square is actually a very powerful tool. So I picked one that's going to have an odd number for the middle term, and you'll understand that for a second. So, we have x squared plus 9x plus 20 equals 0. What I'm going to do is something called completing the square. I'm going to make one side of this a perfect square so that I can then use the square root method and solve it out. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move my 20 to the other side so I have all the x's on the left and the numbers on the right. So this gives me x squared plus 9x equals negative 20. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in plus blank to both sides at this point. That plus blank is the reminder to me about what I'm going to do. Now, when you complete the square, what you're doing is half the middle term squared. Every time it's going to be half the middle term squared. So my middle term is 9. So half of 9 is going to be 9 over 2, and when I square it, I'm going to get 81 over 4. So let's go ahead and add that to both sides of my equation. I'm going to add 81 fourths to both sides because that's half the middle term squared. And what that does to the left side of my equation is it makes it a perfect square. It makes it the square of x plus 9 halves squared. And it's always going to be whatever half that middle term was. And on the right hand side, I actually have to do a little bit of work. Let's see, 4 goes into 81, 20 and a quarter. If I add negative 20 to it, I'm going to get 1/4. Okay, so what I've just done is I added half the middle term to both sides, and that made my left side a complete square, so I factored it out. So from here, I now have a square, and I can use the square root method, just like we just learned, to both sides. Remember, when you square root, you must make it plus or minus, and we get x plus 9 over 2 is equal to plus or minus a half. I'm now going to move 9 halves to the other side, so x equals negative 9 halves plus or minus 1/2. In other words, x is equal to negative 9 plus 1 over 2 or negative 9 minus 1 over 2. So negative 9 plus 1 is going to be 8. 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Negative 9 minus 1 is negative 10. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. So those are my two possibilities, negative 4 or 5. Now, some of you might have said, well, why can't I just factor it from the get-go? Well, this one factored nicely. All right, this one came from x plus 4, x plus 5 equals 0. But they're not always going to come from something so nice. At other times, you're going to end up with negatives and have imaginary numbers. At other times, you're going to have fractions. But this is just the basic process for completing the square.